HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define Our First Amendment Freedoms, by Ian Rosenberg. Read by Chloe Cannon. The constitutional right of free expression is powerful medicine in a society as diverse and populous as ours. It is designed and intended to remove governmental restraints from the arena of public discussion, putting the decision as to what views shall be voiced largely into the hands of each of us. Justice John Marshall Harlan II, Cohen v. California, 1971. Introduction. After the 2018 mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, I was talking to my family at the dinner table about the news report I was reviewing, as part of my job as a media lawyer, on the student survivors turned activists. My children, at the time ages 12 and 10, became very serious about what would happen if they left school during the day to join the national school walkout protests. Could they be punished? What were their rights? Americans of all ages are confronted with increasing frequency by a barrage of free speech questions. What are libel laws, and do they need to be changed to stop the press from lying? Does Colin Kaepernick have a right to take a knee? Can Saturday Night Live be punished for parody? Amid these controversies, we hear free speech shouted as a rallying cry from disparate voices, liberal as well as conservative, from the Women's March to social media trolls. And while Americans are demanding free speech, they are often doing so without necessarily knowing what their rights really entail. Unfortunately, meaningful answers are out of reach unless we know what the First Amendment protects, allows, and restricts. At the same time, cutting through the misinformation and complexities surrounding Supreme Court rulings is a daunting task even for lawyers. Yet conversations like the ones I have had with my kids have compelled me to rethink what I have learned and practiced as a First Amendment lawyer for over 20 years. Contrary to the prevailing opinion in law schools, everyone can have a practical working knowledge of free speech law. The trick is to ditch jargon and academic theory and make an effort to describe how First Amendment law applies to the controversies of today. Wisdom can be condensed without being dumbed down. As a media lawyer and teacher to communications graduate students, most of my career has focused on explaining complicated legal concepts to smart people who are not lawyers. From these experiences, I have distilled a wide spectrum of First Amendment law down to 10 critical cases. Each chapter in this book will focus on a contemporary free speech question, from student walkouts for gun safety to Samantha Bee's expletives, from Nazis marching in Charlottesville to stopping Stormy Daniels from talk show hopping, and then identify, unpack, and explain the key Supreme Court case that provides the answers. Together they create a practical framework for viewing where our free speech protections have come from and how they can develop in the future. Each case also reveals the compelling story of someone who spoke out and ended up fighting for their free speech rights all the way to our nation's highest court. Equally important, the resulting Supreme Court decisions are the stories the justices tell us about the meaning of our Constitution and our country. These surprising and enlightening tales deserve to be known by wider audiences beyond legal circles. In streamlining these concepts, this book deliberately sits in stark contrast to what many first-year students are taught in law school, that the law is like a seamless web. The idea is that you need to study all aspects of the law, with as many details as possible, so that the threads of each decision are woven together in a tightly knit whole that won't unravel. The fight for free speech rejects that academic model as both misleading and impractical. This book is much more like buying a rug at IKEA. It may not be an intricately made tapestry, but it covers what you need just as well, and you can get it a lot quicker and cheaper. My hope in paring it down this way is that you will gain an awareness of your rights, whether you are an organizer planning a protest, an activist on Twitter, or simply an engaged member of your community. Justice David Souter gave a prescient talk in 2012 where he told the story of Benjamin Franklin being asked, shortly after the 1787 convention adjourned, what kind of government the Constitution would give us if it was adopted. Franklin's wise reply was, "A republic, if you can keep it." This remark is particularly imperative to remember in our modern era because, Souter cautioned, you can't keep it in ignorance. We can't hope to keep our democracy alive if citizens remain uninformed of our First Amendment rights and history. In our current cultural landscape, where people are demanding their right to speak and be heard, the fight for free speech is a user's guide for combating ignorance and bringing an understanding of free speech law to all. Come with me and travel through the past. We will meet the unlikely pioneers who went before us and let their journeys illuminate our free speech freedoms today. 1. The Women's March and the Marketplace of Ideas. A wave of pink pussy hats was moving from the Capitol toward the White House. Protesters were holding signs aloft as they participated in the Women's March of 2017. Our rights are not up for grabs. Neither are we. Our arms are tired from holding these signs since the 1920s. My Nana didn't flee Russia for this. The crowds chanted in call and response, "Tell me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like." What began as a post-election Facebook post transformed into over 3 million women and men demonstrating across the country and the globe at over 300 sister events. Gloria Steinem, the feminist standard-bearer and honorary chairwoman of the event, exulted to the crowds, "Thank you for understanding that sometimes we must put our bodies where our beliefs are." Coming the day after the inauguration of President Trump, the march was also intentionally a protest of his election, offering a defiant rebuke of his nascent administration. Civil rights activist Angela Davis addressed the crowds in D.C. and set forth this mission in no uncertain terms. The next 1,459 days of the Trump administration will be 1,459 days of resistance. Resistance on the ground, resistance in the classrooms, resistance on the job, resistance in our art and in our music. Celebrities from the art and music worlds were front and center as featured speakers. Actress America Ferrera kicked things off by telling the crowd, "It's been a heart-rending time to be both a woman and an immigrant. Our dignity, our character, our rights have all been under attack." Scarlett Johansson wanted everyone to get really, really personal and talked about visiting Planned Parenthood when she was 15 years old, where she was treated with compassion, no judgment, and gentle guidance. Madonna caused controversy in some circles, as usual, in her speech that day. With her trademark mix of candor and provocation, she revealed, "Yes, I'm angry. Yes, I am outraged. Yes, I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House." However, in her next breath, she clearly rejected this notion. "But I know that this won't change anything. We cannot fall into despair. We must love one another or die. I choose love." The New York Times reported that the Secret Service had no comment on her statement, adding, though an investigation seemed unlikely. On Fox and Friends, former House Speaker and Republican pundit Newt Gingrich would later say that Madonna ought to be arrested. What Madonna might have been surprised to find out is that 100 short years ago she most likely would not only have been arrested for her speech, but would have been sentenced to years of jail time. She, and all the marchers, owe their First Amendment protections to one tenacious young immigrant who set in motion the events that forever changed our relationship to free speech. In 1913, Molly Steimer arrived at Ellis Island at the age of 16. Her family was fleeing Russia's virulent anti-Semitic discrimination and violence so that she and her 5 brothers, as her parents put it, would be brought up in a free country. Standing just 4'9" tall, Steimer was later described by legendary anarchist and feminist Emma Goldman as diminutive and quaint-looking, with an iron will and a tender heart. She worked in a ladies' shirtwaist factory, laboring long hours to earn $15 a week to support herself and help her family. Life was hard, Steimer wrote. Came home late, got up early. Things began to protest in me against a system of life where people who are hard workers have to struggle bitterly just to be able to exist. These feelings of dissatisfaction led her to reading about anarchism, to search for a way out. Soon, Steimer became deeply devoted to the anarchist ideals of communal property, collective action, and the abolition of government, and firmly believed that this new social order would really make life worthwhile. Steimer joined up with a group of fellow Russian Jewish anarchists, led by Jacob Abrams, a short man with dark eyes, long brown hair, and a thin mustache. Abrams worked as a bookbinder and union leader, and Steimer said his energetic personality won my admiration immediately. Abrams and Steimer, along with their working-class compatriots, the equally tough and fanatical Jacob Schwartz, Hyman Lukowski, both bookbinders, and Samuel Lipman, a furrier, regularly met clandestinely at an apartment in East Harlem. Together, this group published an anarchist journal in Yiddish, first called Der Sturm, the Storm, and later renamed Freiheit, Freedom. In August 1918, Steimer and her fellow anarchists were incensed by the news of a new mission launched as part of the United States' continuing involvement in World War I. President Woodrow Wilson had just announced that he would be sending American troops to Russia. The decision was supposedly made to support Czechoslovak allies in the continuing fight against Germany. However, many viewed the action as little more than a thinly disguised effort to help the White Russians and attack the Red Bolsheviks during their civil war. Steimer saw it as an indefensible attempt to subvert the Russian Revolution, which she wrote would lead to the freeing of mankind. The group decided to produce 2 leaflets furiously denouncing Wilson and his Russian endeavor. Lipman wrote one in English, and Schwartz one in Yiddish, each approximately 400 words. In their rented basement storefront on a newly purchased press, they quickly printed 5,000 copies of each on thin 4x12-inch pieces of paper. The English-language leaflet was titled The Hypocrisy of the United States and Her Allies. It condemned Wilson and attacked his shameful, cowardly silence about the intervention in Russia, which reveals the hypocrisy of the plutocratic gang in Washington and vicinity. The document goes on to lambast the president as too much of a coward to come out openly and say, "We capitalistic nations cannot afford to have a proletarian republic in Russia." It ends with a plea. Will you allow the Russian Revolution to be crushed? You. Yes, we mean you, the people of America. The Russian Revolution cries, "Workers of the world, awake, rise, put down your enemy and mine." Yes, friends, there is only one enemy of the workers of the world, and that is capitalism. Awake, awake, you workers of the world. It was signed simply Revolutionists. It also has a clarifying P.S. that adds, "It is absurd to call us pro-German. We hate and despise German militarism more than do your hypocritical tyrants." The second leaflet, in Yiddish, titled Workers Wake Up, addressed the same concerns but in a more anguished tone, and with a much more particular audience in mind. Pointedly addressing workers in the ammunition factories, it announces that you are producing bullets, bayonets, cannon, to murder not only the Germans, but also your dearest, best, who are in Russia and are fighting for freedom. In contrast to the vaguer advocacy of the English leaflet, this one made a specific call for action. Workers, our reply to the barbaric intervention has to be a general strike. An open challenge only will let the government know that not only the Russian worker fights for freedom, but also here in America lives the spirit of revolution. Do not let the government scare you with their wild punishment in prisons, hanging, and shooting. We must not and will not betray the splendid fighters of Russia. Workers up to fight. Woe unto those who will be in the way of progress. Let solidarity live. This one was signed, The Rebels. Steimer took most of the leaflets to scatter surreptitiously around the city. She threw some from Lower East Side rooftops, and several people who found them were so provoked that they contacted the police. A reserve squad and detectives scoured the neighborhood in search of the perpetrators, without success. Her distribution in the leaflet's words were so shocking as to make New York City headlines the next day, reporting Wilson attacked and circulars from roofs of East Side, and seditious circulars scattered in streets. On August 23, 1918, Steimer took another batch to the factory she worked at and tossed several out the bathroom window. Workers outside the building at 7:45 that morning looked up to see the leaflets fluttering down toward them. Although they couldn't read the Yiddish words, they went to the police, who conducted a floor-by-floor search of the building. With thorough detective work, they found that an employee of the American Hat Company, Hyman Rosansky, had punched in earlier than usual that day. After questioning at police headquarters, Rosansky revealed that he was scheduled to pick up more leaflets from the group that evening on East 104th Street. Steimer later described Rosansky as a sympathizer who expressed a wish to participate, and that, when caught and questioned, he gave us all out. Staking out the rendezvous point from nearby doorways, the police ultimately nabbed Steimer and all the other group members one by one. The interrogations at police headquarters ranged from civil to violent. Steimer claimed that Lakowski, Lippman, and Schwartz were severely beaten. By early the next morning, all of them confessed to their involvement, without implicating one another. The arrests of these anarchists for attacking President Wilson and American war policy made news. The Washington Times called them the Blast Group, and noted that the men wore long hair and were heavily bearded. The New York Journal characterized the girl as defiant and of a quick and alert manner. The defendants were charged with violating the Sedition Act, enacted just 3 months earlier, which made almost all speech critical of the government a crime. This act was an amendment to the Espionage Act of 1917, which primarily criminalized obstructing recruitment to or causing insubordination in the military. Specifically, they were accused of conspiring to unlawfully utter, print, write, and publish disloyal, scurrilous, and abusive language about the U.S. government that was intended to bring it into contempt, scorn, contumely, and disrepute, and to incite, provoke, and encourage resistance to the war. In addition to Steimer and her associates, more than 2,000 individuals would ultimately be prosecuted under the acts, resulting in over 1,000 convictions. The night before their trial, Jacob Schwartz died in the prison ward of Bellevue Hospital. An autopsy determined that pneumonia was the cause of death, but his fellow defendants vehemently rejected that conclusion and believed police brutality was to blame. His friends would place a wreath on his coffin that expressed their sentiments. Jacob Schwartz, as the result of the third degree, on the night of his arrest, August 23rd, died. During her trial testimony, the New York Tribune reported that Steimer clenched her fist and almost screamed, "I insist that Schwartz was killed by the police." An unfinished letter Schwartz had begun before being sent to the hospital helped to cast a legendary glow over what many anarchists viewed as his martyrdom for their cause. "Farewell, comrades. When you appear before the court, I will be with you no longer. Struggle without fear, fight bravely. I am sorry I have to leave you." On October 14th, the anarchist speech trial began in a Manhattan federal district court, the initial trial court in the federal system. Unfortunately for the defendants, a visiting judge from Alabama named Henry Delamar Clayton, Jr. would be presiding. Clayton was racist, anti-women's suffrage, anti-immigrant, and anti-Semitic. One telling example of how these prejudices were blatantly displayed during the trial occurred when Judge Clayton became frustrated with the line of questioning from the defendant's lawyer, Harry Weinberger. Weinberger, whose parents were Hungarian Jewish immigrants, described himself as a pugnacious little fighter. After refusing to allow Weinberger to continue speaking, Clayton told the court, "I have tried to out-talk an Irishman, and I never can do it. And the Lord knows I cannot out-talk a Jew." Clayton seemed incapable of, or unconcerned about, hiding his distaste for the immigrant defendants. During Abrams's testimony, he twice asked, "Why don't you go back to Russia?" At another point with Abrams on the stand, Clayton demonstrated his unwillingness to consider the defendants as Americans. The revealing exchange is recounted in Professor Richard Pollenberg's richly detailed historical study, Fighting Faiths, the Abrams Case, the Supreme Court, and Free Speech. Abrams, speaking in a soft voice, with a distinct Yiddish accent, was earnestly attempting to defend his anarchist beliefs. "This government was built on a revolution," Abrams said, "when our forefathers of the American Revolution." That was as far as he got. "Your what?" Judge Clayton interrupted. "My forefathers," Abrams replied. "Do you mean to refer to the fathers of this nation as your forefathers?" Clayton asked. Abrams said, "We are all a big human family, and those that stand for the people, I call them father." But the judge had made his point, and the jury had no doubt gotten it. Clayton's condescending treatment of Steimer was no better, but she continued to rebelliously assert her beliefs. She refused to stand when the judge entered, and the bailiff called, "All rise," to no avail. When questioned on whether or not she was an anarchist, Steimer pressed to define her philosophy in her own terms. "By anarchism I understand a new social order, where no group of people shall be governed by another group of people. Individual freedom shall prevail in the full sense of the word. Private ownership shall be abolished. We shall not have to struggle for our daily existence as we do now. No one shall live on the product of others. Every one person shall produce as much as he can and receive according to his need. Instead of striving to get money, we shall strive towards educations, towards knowledge. To the fulfillment of this idea I shall devote all my energy, and if necessary, render my life for it." Weinberger made a strenuous final effort to persuade the jury to support free speech in an exhaustive 2-hour closing argument. He contended that the defendants were not supporting the German cause, and therefore were not encouraging resistance to the American war effort. He maintained that even immigrant anarchists had the right to question and protest against an army being sent to Russia to fight the Bolsheviki. They had the right, not because they are American citizens, because they are not, but because they are here and free speech is guaranteed to all citizens and non-citizens. Despite Weinberger's valiant efforts, the outcome of the 2-week trial was hardly in doubt. After little more than an hour, the jury returned guilty verdicts for Abrams, Lukowski, Lippman, Rosansky, and Steimer. On the day of the sentencing, the New York Tribune set the scene. Molly Steimer, a tiny person, dressed in a red Russian blouse, entered the court smiling, with flowers on her arm, which she gave to other defendants except Rosansky, whom they ostracized because he had turned informer. The United States Attorney recommended leniency for Rosansky because of his cooperation with the authorities, and he was sentenced to 3 years in the federal penitentiary. For the men, Clayton imposed the maximum sentence of 20 years each, and he gave Steimer 15. As Steimer responded to her sentence, Clayton attempted to cut her off. "I'm not going to permit you to make a soapbox oration, Molly," he scolded her. "And this is one time that you are brought in contact with the knowledge that there is some authority, even over an anarchist woman." Nevertheless, she persisted. "Though you have sent troops to Russia," Steimer announced to the courtroom, "though you have sent soldiers to slaughter our revolutionists, you cannot crush our revolutionary spirit." The armistice bringing an end to World War I was only weeks away, but Steimer and her anarchist comrades' constitutional battle for free speech had just begun. A year had passed since the anarchists' convictions by the time the Supreme Court heard their case in October 1919. Harry Weinberger summarized his brief in concise terms. "The point is put up pretty straight as to whether or not you have the right to criticize the president and the policies of the government." In his oral argument before the court, Weinberger asserted that the freedom to speak out against the government had been protected by the framers of the Constitution. Those revolutionaries viewed the unabridgeable liberty of discussion as a natural right, and therefore, he boldly claimed, the Sedition Act was unconstitutional. Knowing that the court had at that time never taken such an expansive view of the First Amendment, Weinberger also more pragmatically argued that there was insufficient evidence to support the jury verdict that the defendants had conspired to foster resistance to the war. He reiterated the point he had made to the jury, that in calling for a munitions factory strike, the defendants were not supporting Germany, but rather seeking to defend Russia. Even if some anti-war speech could constitutionally be made criminal, Weinberger maintained that this was speech of a different category. He characterized the leaflets as merely a public discussion of a public policy in reference to a country with which we were not at war. Arguing on behalf of the government was Robert P. Stewart, who had been appointed earlier that year by President Wilson to be the first Assistant Attorney General in charge of criminal matters for the Department of Justice. Stewart's main point was that the court had upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act just 7 months earlier in a case called Schenck versus United States. Since the Sedition Act was an amendment to the Espionage Act and put similar limits on speech, he insisted that the Abrams convictions must be equally constitutional. The Schenck case has been identified by University of Chicago law professor Jeffrey Stone as the Supreme Court's first significant decision interpreting the First Amendment. In Schenck, during the war, 2 leaders of the Socialist Party had been found guilty of obstructing the draft and causing insubordination in the armed forces in violation of the Espionage Act. Their actions had been to print and distribute 15,000 leaflets attacking the draft. "A conscript is little better than a convict," it said, and urging peaceful resistance to it, such as petitioning for the repeal of the act. Some of the leaflets were mailed directly to drafted men. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., writing for a unanimous Supreme Court, affirmed the convictions, including Schenck's 10-year sentence, in short order. The 78-year-old Justice Holmes had been born into a Boston Brahmin family. His father, a prominent physician and writer, coined the term Brahmin to describe New England's elite, served in the Union Army during the Civil War.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?